Appreciate that. Thanks. So I originally wrote this talk for RSA, so it goes into data analytics weeds pretty fast. So, but I'm going to try to break it down in a way that makes a little more sense than me just saying, yeah, look at your endpoints and count things, right? But in reality, look at your endpoints and count things. And what you're going to see in this is those things that you're counting, after you figure out what you need to be counting, actually tell you a lot more about what's happening in your APIs than just you're under attack. But when you're under attack load, those counts are obvious, right? You see it immediately. And I'll show you a few examples of that. My computer wants me to turn on subtitles. I don't know why. I also don't know why it doesn't want to listen. All right, so who am I? Why am I here? I've been looking at websites for about 25 years. My wife is a web developer. She was the only girl in her class forever, a really long time ago. And she came home one day and she said, this guy, Bob O'Neill, broke her web app. And I was like, what? And she goes, yeah, O'Neill. He's got an apostrophe in his name. Completely broke my web app. And I was like, apostrophe? Web app? And that started about a 25-year career of me throwing tick marks at websites and getting error messages back. In 2015, I bought a brand new garage door opener, and I took it out of the box and I put it in, and I went to look for the remotes, and there were no remotes. And I was like, what the heck? And I look in the, directions finally, because that's how it works. And it said, you don't need a remote, you just use your phone. There's an app in there. And I went, an app? Awesome. And I set my phone up and downloaded Burp Cert and started looking at the calls. And I opened my garage door with my laptop, and I called a buddy of mine in California. I live in Ohio, and I said, can you read me the number off the side of the garage door opener you just bought? And he read me the number, and I said, is it opening? And he goes, yes. And I went, sweet, that's going to be a good con talk. I know it is. And I went around the world, and I spoke about API security. I got to give a talk to the royal family in Abu Dhabi. I changed it to compound gates because they don't have garages there. But same kind of thing. I do a lot of GraphQL endpoint inspection. If you're into bug bounties, this is an easy one. Go download Kite Runner and start firing at everything, and you'll start finding GraphQL endpoints. What you're going to find is these endpoints are sitting on infrastructure. They're sitting on all these things that you didn't realize. It also comes with a GraphQL endpoint. So going and turning those things off mean that people can't read your databases. I build tools, I teach, and apparently I travel to KakalakiCon. So what happens when you get attacked on your API flows? Well, it really depends on what the attack is, but it could be your very first indication is customer service says, hey, everybody's passwords just got reset, or we're getting tons of phone calls on this thing happening, or what happened to all these gift card requests that are hitting our endpoints, but it doesn't seem to work. Or failed purchases is one. If you work for a retailer, go look how many times failures happen in your carts. A lot of times this is an indication of people testing credit cards or testing gift cards, right? And you can see these things as they fail. So simply counting the number of times something fails and then noticing when it goes up gives you a huge advantage. So what are we going to talk about today? I'll talk about how API attacks get built. We'll look at some of the indicators that are out there for these things. And then we're going to really talk about a couple of the fun stories that have happened around this. My company, we protect a bunch of different organizations. We look at their APIs, and we have all of this machine learning and analytics and stuff that does all this. But what ends up happening on the backside of this is we stop fraud. And I'll tell you a story later about how we actually sent the police into a store and they stopped somebody from a smash and grab robbery that we predicted through APIs. So let's talk about this thing. When you're going to get attacked, the first phase of this is somebody's got to find you, right? They find you for different means. There's all these different ways that I can figure out where your APIs are, but the easiest is your mobile app. Right? If you have a mobile app, I can take that thing apart. In Android, an APK file is basically a zip, right? I can just rip it apart, run some greps against it, and bang, I have all your API endpoints. But there's more ways of doing it than that, right? I can then start to look for things like, what are your staging endpoints? What are your development endpoints, right? I can go ask the internet, do you have APIs? And if you're a retailer or somebody that publishes API documentation for third-party connections, I'll go read your documents. And that way I can learn how your API works, right? But there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can go through this. That APK mining, I taught a class on that for OWASP. And it's a really effective way to go find API endpoints that are never used. And we had a customer call us and they said, hey, we're under attack on an endpoint that we have never seen traffic on before. And I was like, you're unaware of this API endpoint? Yeah, we didn't know it was here. And we're getting attacked. And so we look at it and the machine is doing its job and it's throwing the traffic away because I identified it as an attack, and we're running through the motions of this thing. And I said, well, where is this endpoint? Why do you have this thing? And the security team said, I don't know, we'll get with the developers. They call it developers, right? It goes back a couple of iterations to find out that 3 years ago they'd hired a contractor. Anybody heard a story like this before? And they put this in there, and what it was an entitlement verification. All this endpoint did was when you submitted an email address to it, it would come back and say it's a member of this rewards program or this rewards program, unless it didn't exist, and then it would give you this error message that said that the account didn't exist. Well, anytime I send you an email address and you tell me that it doesn't exist, I can test a big list of email addresses to see which one exists, and then it's on to the next phase where you go get credentials, right? So I said, well, where is this endpoint? How did they learn about this endpoint? Is it in documentation? Where is it? And I had my intern, I got an intern, I had my intern go take the APK apart, and he's like, it's right here. It's in the app. The reason that it's being called is that you can just go find it, right? I don't have to use the app the way you tell me to. I use it my way. So what happens after the recon phase is you're going to get tested, right? And you'll see this in bug bounty programs. They'll tell you, the guy that was up here before will tell you, you can go scan these sites and you can go look for these things. Well, that testing gets loud, right? But oftentimes it's just low volume testing. Is there an email? Are you checking it? What do you accept? What do you not accept? Do I have to have these headers? Do I not have to have these headers? Right? So you start to look for all these different things. But then you start to see people when they're under attack. It's either I'm trying to throw you off by making you think that I'm just a scanner, or I'm actually trying to do this. So does anybody know what the XML RPC.php is? What is it? WordPress, right? These are the RPCs that WordPress allows. Does anybody know what the defaults are? All on. Right? Everything's on. So if you have a WordPress site that has everything on, I can use that as a proxy endpoint, and now I have your IP address as my IP address, so that way I can route traffic off of you. The reason I mention this is, please go turn this off, because I have to deal with proxies all the time. So then what happens after I figure out, well, one works, right? Well, the next thing that happens is I'm going to write some scripts, right? Or I'm going to do something to actually go perform my attack. Oftentimes these are command line tools. It's just Python scripts, right? ChatGPT will shoot them out to you as fast as you want. And you can put stuff together like that, but there's already purpose-built tools for this. If you're attacking an e-commerce website, OpenBullet or Sentry MBA is probably going to be the tools that you want. For those tools, it's basically request and response infrastructure, and then all you're telling it is, this is what the username field looks like, this is what the password field looks like. You build this little config file, dump in a bunch of credentials, go, right? Or have it make credentials for you. When you go to the bots as a service layer, then you're talking about tools like Essentials. There's a whole bunch of carting tools that are out there. If you really want to dive into this and go way into the weeds, just pull up YouTube and put in chef and sneakers as the search, and you're going to get all these tools, how they work, how to rent them, all that kind of stuff. We see this a lot because we deal with a lot of hype sales, right? Taylor Swift can tell you all about hype sales now. Most of us understand what hype sales are to a new degree. And so when I talk about hype sales, I'm talking about volumetric things that are happening against your API endpoint. So I'm doing things like trying to buy 1,000 pairs of shoes, right? And I'll talk about that in one of the stories that comes up a little bit later. We had a customer that came to us and said, we're under attack load, can you take a look at it? We looked at it, everything was fine, we were mitigating, but 350,000 account attempts in 25 minutes, all from different IP addresses, right? You don't have to even play IP whack-a-mole. The moles are everywhere, and there's nothing that you can do about it. GraphQL batching attacks allow for you to do things like send me this person's data, and this person, and this person, and this person, and this person, and I can just dump the whole database in a single request, right? It's going to be volumetric responses then, not volumetric requests, right? So the IOCs are going to be different based on the different things. Now, once I start running this thing, somebody's going to figure it out, right? My intern was just working on something the other day, and he's like, oh no, all of a sudden I'm getting 403s. I'm like, well, their bot defense just caught you or something, right? Your IP got banned. So what we're going to do is retool, right? We're going to use a different credential list. We're going to use different infrastructure. We're going to have to make changes, otherwise we're going to get stuck, right? We're going to get caught in the middle of this attack. So as a defender, you're always looking at, well, what are they using a validated list, or are they using a list that's not validated? What I mean by that is when the requests come in, does the account exist, right? You know that on the backside. You should never tell the customer that, the user that, but it's something that you should understand. What ends up happening then is we move into an infrastructure situation where I need IP addresses. I can't just use my IP address, and Tor networks are notoriously easy to find and torn apart, so it's pretty easy to throw away Tor networks. So I'm going to have to do something, and I'm probably going to have to pay money for it. How many of you use a VPN on your phone? Have any of you read the terms and conditions for that VPN? Ola VPN is one that I've seen a lot of people use. The terms and conditions on the back of that say that you become a proxy node in another network. You get free VPN service, and they get to send traffic to you every now and then. They try to keep it light, but you signed up for this. You became a proxy endpoint. Those server-based proxies are less expensive than those residential proxies. So for me to use your phone as my proxy endpoint, I have to spend a lot of money on that. Disrupting the attacker is what we try to do. If you move into residential-based proxies, it's a lot harder to tell, right? And I have a graph later that's going to show you what it looks like when an attack shifts from the perspective of communication ISPs, what's hitting you. You have a question? Yeah, set-top boxes. It's usually compromised set-top boxes in Southeast Asia. All right, so are IOCs different in APIs? Well, they are a bit. The way that you find them is a little bit different, right? So what's an IOC? Well, piece of digital forensics that shows that you've been compromised, right? And just like any kind of physical evidence, all right, you're going to see these attacks happen. There's going to be footprints left. There's going to be fingerprints. There's going to be something left. And what that is often the counts. So what are the common IOCs? Well, if you look at login endpoints, one of the things that you really should be looking at is your failure rate. During the day, how many times have people failed to log in? The reason that you want to look at this is because when you're under attack load, when someone's doing a credential stuffing attack against you, your failure rate's going to go through the roof, right? Compared to your success rate, it's going to be completely different. How many of you are data analysts or want to do data and analytics? Data analytics is the next thing that security is going to be. So start reading the books now, I guess. But this is how we derive this stuff, right? Is through analytics. So it can look like, just regular user behavior, right? I know what browser make and model the users are touching me. But if you start to look at attack patterns, you'll notice attackers are lazy. They'll use the same old Chrome that, they had put in their user agent strings a long time ago, and it was probably the new one that day, 5 years ago, when they made the script. So you can start to see these kinds of things in there. Obviously, that's an easy one to change. Some of the stuff that needs data science, though, is things like organizational flow. What ISPs touch your organization? And what I mean by that is everybody that's logging in coming from standard ISPs, Verizon, AT&T, whoever, or are they coming from someplace else, right? Are they coming from another place on the planet? And so you have to really have a good understanding of what's coming in and what it's supposed to be coming in. Well, when we start to do analytics data pivots on users, we do things like this user logs in typically from, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, whatever, right, someplace in the United States. When packet 1 comes from France and packet 2 comes from China, that user didn't do that, right? That's not a thing. So being able to perform analytics on that allows you to see those things. I'm going to build this. Scraping is another thing that we get a lot of calls for. Scraping isn't illegal in the US. You're allowed to scrape websites, right? But people don't want it, right? Doing things like finding out, prices or internal whatever. So attackers are going to come after you and look for these things. So your biggest scraping problem, that biggest bubble, are the kids that are just figuring this out, right? They're running wget or they're running something against your site to just pull things off of it. Usually a single IP, usually a single user agent, very easy to see, right? You can get rid of them pretty quickly. But move down to the bottom, high volume of single IP requests and high user agent rotation. This looks like one request came from China, next request came from Vietnam, next request came from somewhere else, and you can't really see patterns inside of this until you start to add this together. And I'm going to show you what that looks like here in just a sec. Account takeover is another type of attack that you're going to want to set yourself up for, to look at the data pivots that are going to tell you what's happening during an account takeover attack. During this style of attack, it's almost always credential stuffing, but it's not always an unvalidated list. So it's not going to be as noisy as you think it is. It's probably going to be users that look like they can't log in. In preparation for this, we've got to have good credentials. We're going to have tools and infrastructure all lined up. So if you think about the IOCs that come along with that, it's the credential list, what tools might be hitting you, so there's user agents in there, and what infrastructure is the IP addresses. When you start to look at the initial requests that come through, right, it's just, I'm trying to see what you're doing. Are you going to give me error messages, right? A few years ago, I'm an avid gardener, and I have a little greenhouse on my property, and I'd planted a bunch of cucumbers, and I went out there in the morning, and they were all mowed off in the greenhouse. And I thought, well, what the heck's getting in my greenhouse and eating cucumber? What eats cucumber plants? And they're prickly. And so I bought a little camera, and I stuck it at the end of the greenhouse, and the camera came with an app, and I'm me. So I started looking at this app, and I found out that it was vulnerable to credential stuffing, because when I put in the right username and the wrong password, it would tell me error, bad password. And when I put in the wrong username, it would say error, bad username. I can use just those error messages to build a validated credential list, right, and then go fire it. It was a groundhog. So I got a cute picture of him. Little jerk. So you may see successes in this, you may see failures, but this is just the beginning. You're not seeing volume, right? It's the volume that really helps here. So then you'll start to see all of the credential stuffing tool kind of behaviors where we're getting a lot of IP rotation, we're getting all of this stuff, but you're going to see bad authentication requests, right? Payment card enumeration is another one of these things. If you work for a retailer, you probably see this happening. What I'm seeing now more and more of is we have a third party, you've got Bamar tokens or whatever that you're going to generate, and we see people pre-generating tokens, right? They'll run a whole bunch of credit card numbers and expiration dates and possible CVVs to see can they get error messages back. And if your system isn't built right, it'll actually help them figure out what the CVV is on a credit card number. If your system is built even better, you'll confuse them by giving them several answers that are yes, right? And so you can do that kind of behavior with this. But when you look at like gift cards, for instance, you'll find the endpoint for a gift card, and you can just start sending numbers into it and get things back. I have a customer that's in Canada that we stop 50 grand a month bleeding out through gift cards, just somebody guessing the gift cards. And I was shocked when I first saw it because they were like, we don't know why this is happening. And I said, well, it's easy. You let anyone type any gift card number in and you tell them what it's worth, right? That's a bad workflow. That's definitely a bad business logic flow. Make them log in, right? That's an easy thing. Give it a PIN, right? There's a whole bunch of different ways that you can make this a little bit better. We see payment card enumeration and stuff that comes through on a valid account, right? So we'll do things like, rather than go prefetch a token, I'll buy something that has zero value from you. And I'll use your processes to see, is this credit card valid, right? Once I find that API endpoint, I'm not clicking through anything anymore. I write a script and fire it, right? I don't have to do anything with your actual website. So the way that you're going to find all this stuff is through instrumentation of your infrastructure. You're going to find this by looking at your Nginx. You're going to be looking at logs. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of things that you can do to instrument yourself to see these things. But really the important point here is you've got to be able to count when things are happening, right? You have to be able to count that I logged in or didn't log in, and I have to be able to look at things like IP addresses. And I'll show you an example here just in a couple of secs about how this is all going to fit together. So what do you look for to find the attacks, right? Well, the first thing is know what your endpoints are. Inventory, step one. Know that you have login endpoints or sign in or authenticate or reset password, whatever endpoints you might have on your environment. Now, if you're a retailer or somebody that has a checkout flow, you're going to have carts, checkout, order, that kind of stuff in your APIs. Inside of this, you want to make sure that you're collecting things. So you can see on the login flow, I'm saying collect usernames, collect session tokens, collect IP addresses, collect login successes and login failures, right? These are all going to be data pivots for analytics here in a sec. Collect usernames, sessions, IP addresses, etc. for the checkout. Item availability, that's usually somebody scraping you, right? So that's IP addresses and user agents almost always. And any other kind of statistic that might be there. So why am I so focused on data analytics? Why am I so focused on doing this through some kind of data search, right? Does anybody know the John Snow thing from England in 1854? This is the first use of mapping for data analytics. There was a cholera outbreak in London, and each one of the little black dots that's on here means something. It means somebody died there. So John Snow drew this map, started coloring the map in, and realized that there's a place in London that's causing this. And it was a water pump. It was simply a water pump. The water pump had cholera in it, and the solution to the problem was to take the pump handle off. Ended the cholera outbreak. But it's the first time that somebody sat down and actually used data analytics to figure out a problem that didn't seem to have a lot of data inside of it. So how do we use this stuff? Well, we have to look at those indicators, right? Remember I said IP address is going to be one of those things that's tough because they're going to rotate through them, but they're not infinite. If you go buy from Bright House or Illumina, I don't know what they're called anymore. If you go buy a bunch of proxy requests from them and start pushing data through them, they're going to spray you across maybe 20 IP addresses, maybe 30, right? It costs a lot of money to start getting huge numbers of IP addresses. It costs a lot of, sort of taxing effort to make your proxies bounce around like that. So this is the kind of stuff that actually happens. Remember, I said counting's important. I see these two IP addresses and they both have 3,400 requests coming from them. Odd? Yes. Right? This is how data analytics works. This is us pointing out the outliers. Whoever is using these IP addresses is attacking us, right? And then what you'll see is they'll stop. and then 4 or 5 more IP addresses will show up, and they'll all have the same counts on them, because the proxy service is just doing this kind of round-robin spray across a certain number of IP addresses, and it makes it so that you can see it pretty easily, right? If you understand where your IP addresses are, or where they should be coming from, then you can understand if this is good traffic or bad traffic. I've got a customer in Canada that, they only do business in Canada. So when traffic comes to them from Russia, from China, from England, doesn't matter, we throw it away, right? So if you start to rotate IP addresses that are outside of the country norms, we get rid of this stuff. So what data pivots do you need to have? Well, I always start out with IP address and username. And I try to make those pivots easily complementary, right? I want to know, does this user always come from this IP address? Do you always come from the same IP address? No. You probably have 3, right? So if you set your systems up to alert you when an IP address, when a user is coming from more than 3 IP addresses, it doesn't necessarily have to send you a page or anything like that. It just, dink, right? We put a bit in a bucket, and we're going to count them later. Similarly, user agents, right? How many of you guys use Chrome? How many of you use Safari? How many of you use Firefox? How many of you use all of them? That's a better answer. Try to use as many as you can. But understand population densities and what those things are that relate to them. So things like user agents are going to come from a specific population. On your API flows from your mobile app, there shouldn't be a user agent. It should be whatever the agent is set in your app. So if you see Firefox showing up on your mobile app flow, throw it away, right? Pretty simple. And a lot of these things are simple like that. So you have to look out for scanners. I mentioned earlier that I do a lot of stuff with GraphQL. I've sat down with the Asset Notes Kite Runner and kind of tore it apart and looked at sort of successful things that are inside of it, and I think this list is pretty good, but what ends up happening is somebody will go look for all of your subdomains. Then they'll go through and they'll try to figure out which one is your API endpoint subdomain. From the list on the left, can you tell which one's the APIs? I didn't just type that in to be funny. This is what real life looks like. They always call it API dot whatever. Staging is usually staging something. UAT is usually UAT something. And then you just throw a little GraphQL on the end of it and see, do you get an answer back, right? If anybody has their phone out and wants to try this, you go to api.fly.io/GraphQL and you get their GraphQL playground. It's their demo site. It's not a hack. But it's just one of those things that it's easy to find. All right, so customer calls me and says, hey, we see this weird traffic hitting this inventory endpoint from these couple of IP addresses. Can you tell us what's happening here? And I look at it and I go, well, it seems like they're interested in 2 items. It's these 2 SKUs, and they seem to be interested in these 4 stores. And what this was this is a beauty sales customer that is one of my customers that sells the Dyson hairdryer. Does anybody know what the Dyson hairdryer? I'm not a hairdryer enthusiast. Do you know what a Dyson hairdryer is? It's a good one, yeah? Excellent. I don't use a hairdryer all that often for various reasons. So they give us a phone call. Hey, we don't know what's going on here. So we start to look at this and we go, all right, well, they're only interested in a few of the SKUs and they're only interested in a few of the stores. Let's try to figure out a way to make them go to one of the stores. So one of the things that we can do is deceptive response. So we built it so that if it came from these IP addresses, we would tell them that this one store had 8 of them, right? Which would be what they would get on the day the truck showed up, right? So it wasn't out of scope totally, but it definitely was lying to them. So they showed up at the store, and in this particular store, they'd hang these things in the back behind a counter, and these 2 people shot into the store as fast as they could. They ran to the back counter, and the person behind the counter was an off-duty cop. The person at the front door was an off-duty cop. And we had moved everything. We called the store and told them move everything off to the side so that they can't find it. And they ran around the store looking for it, could not figure out where it was. Finally, they saw it, and they shot out the front door. And they grabbed them on the way out. These are $600 hair dryers, right? And there's a curling iron hair dryer set that you can buy that's even more. And this is what they wanted. These thieves were using the inventory APIs to figure out where these things were, right? People say criminals aren't really smart. These are some smart criminals, right? Able to figure this thing out. Hype sale example, right? Like I said, Taylor Swift can tell you all about hype sales now. Everybody knows what a bot is on the planet, I think, at this point. So we all really are under this understanding that sometimes people want to buy things. So this is one of my customers. They launched 1,000 Nike Dunks. Dunks are really big with the kids, I guess. So what happens is when a hype sale happens, it depends on kind of the e-commerce platform that you're using. But basically, what's going to happen is a couple of minutes before the sale, the bots are going to show up, and they're going to start building checkout carts, right? They need to do that because they want to be a step ahead of you. So what they do is they put a pair of socks in a cart. So now they have a cart built, and they're ready to check out. Then what they do is they find the update workflow, and they say, instead of one pair of socks, I want one pair of Dunks. They swap it out in the update, right? So carts get created. The scrapers start looking for the SKU. We have to have the SKU so we can swap it out, right? So about a minute before the drop, they're going to figure out what the SKU is because it's either going to be a live blank page or it's going to stop erroring or something. Something's going to tell them, here's the SKU. This is the one that you want. They're going to go swap it into their cart and hit checkout while you're trying to add the thing to the cart. That's how they beat you. They do it every time. But these come in massive volumes. This was 25 million requests to the checkout operation for 1,000 pair of shoes. 25 million requests. This is volumetric, right? And we could easily see it. And we were just throwing all this traffic away as it came in. During this attack, we threw away 99.8% of the traffic that came in. We identified it as bots and chucked it out, right? And we did it through this kind of data analytics, just simply counting. From these IP addresses, it's got to be bad. That IP address gets thrown away. Yep. So this is what happened when Taylor Swift's concert tickets went on sale. They went in and figured out the workflow, and then instead of saying, I want one seat, they were doing things like, I want seat 1 and 2, seat 1, 2, and 3, seat 1, 2, 3, and 4, and whichever transaction worked, that's the one that they picked and bought, right? And then they started relisting. So immediately they were putting the stuff on StubHub and everything like that. We see this same thing with shoes, right? I'll go look on eBay right before one of my customers will do a drop, and I'll see the shoes they're going to sell available on eBay. They haven't bought them yet. Yep.
So the credit card processors actually do this as well.
They do.
So how much interaction and support do you have from them to recognize this and shut it down?
Yeah, so the questions here end up being, he was asking what about the credit card processors and how do they feel about this and how would you go about getting it shut down that way. What ends up happening is these guys are limited by certain things. They're limited by the number of addresses they can ship shoes to, right? Most of these guys, they won't let you buy, set up 800 accounts and try to order shoes for them. So they have to do tricks. The credit card companies don't really care if they're doing this because they're not liable in any way. The only thing that they're concerned with is when they have 50 credit card numbers, right? Because they want to know how they did that and how that transaction happens. All we do is flag this stuff and forward it on. I hope some credit card company cares about it. But I don't think they do.
Yeah, that can't be true because they have to handle the cancellations and the reprocessing of that. It's an expensive exercise.
It is, yeah. My customer's the retailer, and so I don't get super involved with that. I do work with DigitalOcean pretty often because as soon as a credit card number list gets dumped, DigitalOcean servers all spin up and they start testing them for stuff. But when you look at transactions like this, they're trying to be legitimate on the financial side because they actually want the shoes, right? But it's fun to go to YouTube and watch videos of guys that bought 100 pairs of shoes and they can't sell them. I mean, that's a good time.
I've literally described 3 months of my life's research.
Well, I'm glad you got to spend some time in the Matrix with us. So this is my data analytics example. This is kind of the last slide here, but this is my data analytics example, and I can show you in this what happens when you start to get a bot attack, right? When we're counting things, we start to count new things. So on the left side, this is legitimate traffic. Look at the chart. It's laid out pretty well, right? It's pretty good pie slices. Everybody seems to be eating this a good amount, except for that one guy. Comcast is, eating much more. Then the attack starts, and look what happens, right? We get a huge focus on Cogent. Cogent is, anytime I see Cogent light up in my organizations that are hitting somebody, I know these are bots. They apparently have the world's oldest set-top boxes, and they're all vulnerable, and they've all been compromised. But you can see we still get Verizon Wireless, we still get Comcast Cable Spectrum, we're still seeing the same amount of traffic that's on the legitimate part. It's just all of a sudden that bot traffic starts to take over, right? Because they're so volumetric. APIs are meant for computers to talk to each other. Computers talk to each other really fast, right? And we can speed that up over and over and over again. The faster I can move the data, the faster we can communicate. APIs are the gateway into your data on the back end, and you built a system that allows me to ask for that data as fast as I want, right? We have to look at our API usage and our utilization. We have to look at this stuff from the perspective of what if I'm under attack right now. The IOCs are right there. You can see them quite easily as long as you're doing the counting, right, and looking for those different things that might be in there. So that's basically all I have for this. If you want to scan QR codes, people like that. I don't know. My LinkedIn thing is on there. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, that'd be fun. There's also a QR code up here for a free tool that will go find your API endpoints that my company does. Yep.
So not to be that pedantic, semantic seeker, but when I hear the term indicator of compromise, to me, it's for the first time, it's compromise. They're in the system.
Yes.
Is the compromise of availability and or integrity? I don't look at confident. I mean, how do you look at it when we talk? They're attacking it. It's under attack. And
right.
Somehow now it's been compromised.
So the compromise comes from in account takeover attacks. I've taken over the accounts and seat spinning attacks. I've taken over the inventory or inventory takeover attacks, however you want to call that. The compromise here is when they figure out how to get to your data, how to get to your transactions, how to do things, the compromise is they'll then do it, right, as fast as they want. It's not that they're going to take your systems offline. It's not a denial of service thing. It's literally, I've figured you out, and I'm now going to get as much data as I can, as many credit cards as I can, whatever that thing is. Yep.
How effective are API security gateways at stopping or at least detecting a lot of this?
Yeah, so if you take the security part out of API gateway, then you're saying it right. They're not security gateways. Nobody has one. Apogee will tell you our gateway helps with security, and it doesn't. They're literally like ways to make your data flow, right, and kind of control the data flow that goes through the gateway. They're not there for security.
Do they at least gather the information that you need to reduce the effect?
Oftentimes they can, but it's easier to get it out of whatever the endpoint is landing on, so Nginx or something like that.
The new marketing buzzword is web application and API firewall. Web.
Yeah. What? AF. This is the what? Yeah. All right. So what I didn't tell you guys at the beginning of this, because I wanted to see who'd hang out with me, is I have a Flipper Zero to give away. Who doesn't know what a Flipper Zero is? All right, so I'm a lock picker. and I dropped a bunch of lockpicks over in the Locksport thing. You can get a free set of lockpicks if you'd like. This is in essence an electronic lockpick. It does shenanigans really well. You can open Teslas and Toyotas with it, but you can also turn TVs off and all of that kind of thing. There's a really good subreddit if you're into Reddits on Flipper Zeros. They're a really cool and fun thing, and you can't get them. Usually they're sold out. I happened by their website one day, and I bought all of them. And I go around to conferences, and I give them away. Huh? Via an API, yeah. Of course. Well, I know how cart creation works. So what I like to do